Hello, so today we're going to continue talking about the 1920s and we're going to start looking at another social change that happens in the 1920s, and that is the Great Migration and the Harlem Renaissance. So the Great Migration actually kind of goes over, we talked about it with Unit 2 because it does start happening during World War I, but it continues to happen during the 1920s, and it is a major cause of something that happens called the Harlem Renaissance, which is a celebration of culture, specifically African American culture in the 1920s. So that's why we need to look at both of these parts. And for us to understand the Harlem Renaissance, we have to understand what the Great Migration was, and we have to understand what caused it to happen so we can get a better understanding of the Harlem Renaissance. So that's what we're going to look at today. So, I just wanted to show you these pictures because these should all relate to the reading that you looked at with the Great Migration background. And you read about how starting in World War I, there was a mass migration of millions of African Americans out of the South and into the North. And so you can see here, this is at like a train station. All these people are getting ready to leave the South, go to the North. You can see some took cars. This is a map that kind of shows this migration stream and how the changes in Black population in the South and in the North, especially in northern cities. And over here you can see the percentage of African Americans living in the American South and how that changes dramatically, really starting about 1920, and how it decreases dramatically. And that's all because of this Great Migration. And the Great Migration isn't something that happens in 1 year. It continues to happen in really 2 waves that last through the 1970s. So we're really talking about this first wave of the Great Migration, but it's not something that, like I said, happens overnight. It's something that takes a while to happen. So we're going to look at why the Great Migration happened, and we're going to look at it through the lenses of history. So our lenses of history, which we've talked about many times so far this year, are social, political, and economic. So social means, of course, how do people live? How do they interact with one another? Political means the role of the government, laws, the enforcement of laws, or leaders. And economic has to do with money, jobs, income. So those are the 3 ways that we look through history, and we're going to continue looking at through history through those lenses as we look at what caused the Great Migration today. So the first thing I wanted to look at was this chart. And this chart is going to tell us one of these lenses, and also we're going to be looking at whether it is an example of a push or pull factor. So basically, after we're done analyzing the source, we're going to be able to put a X into one of those columns, and that's going to give us a better idea of whether this represents a push factor or a pull factor, and what lens of history it represents as well. And then at the end, you're going to be considering it in the bigger picture and looking at those causes for the Great Migration. So this one says the number of agricultural workers in Georgia. Georgia is a state in the South, of course, and this is in 1910. So you can see the different type of agricultural workers. These are farm workers. Somebody who owns land, a tenant farmer rents the land that they farm on, but they own the crops they produce. And then a sharecropper works for a landowner. They're paid with a share of the crop, so a part of the crop, which can be sold for a profit. So they are working on somebody else's land for a little bit of money. That's a sharecropper. So you can see the percentage of Black workers that were landowners, tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and wage workers. Oh, sorry, wage workers are going to be down here. I should have a separate bullet for that. Sorry. And total. And so you can see here that the most African Americans during this time are going to either be wage workers, or they're going to be sharecroppers or tenant farmers. So most do not own land. And what that tells us is they're really restricted on how much money they're able to make if they're going to farm. Because if they're a sharecropper or a wage worker or even a tenant farmer, they owe somebody else money with their crop. If they're a sharecropper or a wage worker, then they don't get to keep all the money that they get from their crop because they have to pay some of it back to the landowner. So we need to think about whether or not this represents an economic, political, or social issue, and whether this would be pushing Black Americans out of the South or pulling them to the North. So I think this is going to represent an economic issue because it has to do with money. And I think this is going to represent a push factor because this is really restricting African Americans and their ability to make money in the South because this is holding them down. This is oppressing them. So the next one that we're going to look at has to do with lynching. Lynching is when somebody is killed without there being a trial or without there being been found guilty. There's no legal reason. It's not like it's at the death penalty kind of situation. Somebody is just taken and killed. It's murder, essentially. And you can see from this map the black victims of lynching from 1882 to 1968. 1968 is it's very close to recent day, and that's what's make this all the more terrifying. And you can see this by state, and you can see very clearly the distinction between North and South. And it's not to say that there are not any lynching that happens in the North, because there are some. I mean, you can see here with Ohio and Illinois and Indiana, you can see that there are some, Missouri, but most of these are taking place in the South, and you can pretty much draw a line there. And places like, Alabama and Mississippi, I mean, this is upwards of 500 black victims of lynching in that state, and that is just horrific. And this does have to do with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, which happens during this Great Migration time period. It happened after the Civil War, but then it happens again during the early 1900s and up through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and really until the Civil Rights Movement. So I wanted to read this right here, this little passage, to give us a little bit of better insight about what this meant to the individuals who experienced this and whose families experienced this. It'd be nearly impossible for George or any other colored boy in that era to grow up without the fear of being lynched, the dread that he might be accused of something and suddenly find himself in a circle of tormentors with no one to help him. By the time little George was old enough to notice, it seemed as if the whole world was crazy, not because of any single event, but because of the slow discovery of just how restricted his life was turning out to be. All this stepping off the sidewalk, not looking at the direction of a white woman, and sirring and mamming, and even death awaiting any misstep. So this really shows the terror and the fear that Black Americans lived in the South during this time period that we're talking about, and continued well into the 1900s. And this is a fear, this domestic terrorism. Really, it's terrorism that's happening inside of our country for Black Americans. And it was very dangerous in the South. Now, there are still threats, there's still tension, there's still violence that happens in the North, but the threat is much more real in the South, as you can see. So this, I think, would be an example of a social push factor, because this is how people are living, how they're interacting with others, and this is definitely a reason why some people would want to leave the South and go to the North, where it might be a bit safer. Okay. So this next one talks about how in the North there are more job opportunities, as we're going to see. And there is not only more job opportunities, but there's more opportunities in general. So this person is this writer who is himself African American, refers to Blacks as colored. This is short for colored. While this label is no longer socially acceptable, it is a common term used in the time. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to read through this. And again, we're trying to figure out if this would be an example of a push or pull factor, and if it represents a social, political, or economic factor. So, dear old friend, the moments I thought I'd write to you for a few true facts of the present condition of the North. Certainly I am trying to take close observation, and now it is true the colored men are making good. Never pay less than $3 a day or 10 hours. I do not see how they pay such wages the way they work laborers. They do not hurry or drive you. Remember, this is the very lowest wages. They receive their pay every 2 weeks. This city I'm living in, the population of 30,000, 20 miles from the big Chicago. Doctor, I am somewhat impressed. My family also they are doing nicely, and I have no right to complain whatever. I wish many times that you could see our people up there, as they are entirely different light. People are coming here every day and are finding employment. Nothing here but money, and it's not hard to get. Oh, I have children in school every day with the white children, and I will write to you more next time. So this person is writing home to a friend about what their experiences are in the North and how they are much different than the experiences that many Black Americans are having in the South during this time period, because we're talking about 1917. So some of the things that they're writing about is that they have pay, they have more job opportunities, there's more pay for Black Americans in the North, and their children are able to go to school and they're getting good quality school or equal quality school to white children, as they're talking about in this text. So I think this really represents both an economic and a social aspect of history, because it's talking about how they're treated more equal in the North, and economic because there's definitely more opportunities for them. And so these are going to be both examples of push factors, I think, pull factors, because these are good things that are going to influence maybe his friend to end up moving north. Now, there's a couple other sources that we were going to look at in class, but in the sake of time, I really can't go over them right now because I only have 12 minutes. But these are going to represent different examples of push and pull factors and the different aspects of history. And so at the end, I really hope that you'll take a second and look at this chart. Maybe go through the slides on your own and look at this chart and figure out what is causing people to migrate, what is pushing them out of the South, and what is pulling them north. And that's important because as we look at some of the effects of the Great Migration, we see that it's really because of how terrible the conditions are in the South and how many more opportunities there are in the North for Black Americans. It's not because everything is better. There's still tension, there is still discrimination, there is still violence, but it is a better alternative than the South, and that is why millions of Black Americans moved north. So what are some of the effects of the Great Migration? There's an increased African American population in the North. There's a resurgence, however, of the KKK and domestic terrorism against Black Americans, both in the South and in the North. We are going to see the KKK kind of, for lack of a better term, follow Black Americans to the North, and they are also going to have discrimination and terrorism against Black Americans in the North as well. These racial tensions do leave northern cities segregated, where there are places in the city where Black Americans are allowed to live and places where they're not allowed to live. And you can see in this map here for Chicago, you can see that in 1930, I'm looking for my pen here, I don't know where it went, there it is. In 1930, the percentage of African Americans living in different neighborhoods in Chicago, and you can see that they're pretty much being restricted to living in very specific areas. And this is called redlining, and literally city government officials and also banks that would give loans out for people to buy homes and rent and whatever would only allow Black Americans to live in very specific areas. So they were kind of forced to live in these areas and segregated in these cities as well. And that kind of in a part leads to these mass grouping of African Americans from all over the South and really all over different places of the world, literally from Africa, from the Caribbean, and they're all bringing different parts of their own cultures, which mix together and form an African American celebration of culture during this time period called the Harlem Renaissance. So it is a celebration of Black culture in America, and it's a boom of Black artists and Black authors and musicians. And it's everybody in the United States enjoys it at that time. And jazz is one of the things that comes out of it. And that's enjoyed by everybody on the radio and jazz clubs and jazz concerts. And so this is a celebration of Black culture, and it is called the Harlem Renaissance. And so that's what you're going to be looking at for your assignment. You're going to be looking at some of its impacts. You're going to look at some of the major players in the Harlem Renaissance, so major authors and artists and musicians. Just gather a little bit more about what that celebration of Black culture meant to the people who experienced it. So that is what your assignment is for today. Let me show you where it is. Okay, so for your assignment, it is the Harlem Renaissance assignment, and you are going to be using the Harlem Renaissance reading that is located in the same folder to complete the assignment. So it is a normal Miss Morris assignment. We have a reading and some questions, and all of that is based, like I said, all the questions are based on the reading that is in this folder, so you're not looking randomly on the internet. you're looking on this folder to complete it. So you're going to just answer in the yellow boxes for each of these questions, and then you also have your big question. All right, so I'll see you next time next week. We will continue talking about the 1920s.